Hi, Bill. Hi, Heather. Hey, Bellamy. Get my documents up here. Okay. And here, okay.
Afternoon, all. I'm still not very visible.
Good afternoon, Bill.
Hey, Bellamy. Hey, Hansel.
Hey, Jeff. How are you? Hey, Ansel.
Hi, Nancy. And Cynthia.
May sign off intermittently to gobble my dinner down, but you know.
Hey, James.
Hey, Jeff. I don't know. Am I on mute?
Nope, loud and clear.
See your face only for some reason.
Ah, can't hear me?
If
I can hear you,
you go to
but I
the view
can't.
in the upper right and just put
Oh,
it
yeah, there
on
we
like
go.
gallery.
Cool, I got it. Thank you.
Hi, Cynthia.
Get to my mute button fast enough. Hello, how is everyone?
Good, thanks.
Good.
Hey.
Chair Brown, are you, is everyone here on your end? It's going to be a little late.
Mayor Walker, I will.
Ms. Gilmore's not here, Mr. Chair.
I will send Ms. Gilmore a message.
Okay.
She's currently not here.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay.
Mayor Walker, are we expecting Mr. Snook?
As he'll be joining us shortly. He's just running a little behind today.
Great, thank you.
Mayor Walker, Ms. Gilmore has a family emergency and she will not be joining us tonight.
Okay. All right. Well, we can go ahead and get started. So I'll call this meeting to order. Ms. Thomas, would you do roll call, please?
Mayor Walker,
Present.
Vice Mayor McGill,
Here.
Councillor Hill,
I'm here.
Counselor Payne,
Here.
Counselor Snook. Okay.
And Chair
Uh,
Brown,
And I called the Police Civilian Review Board to order. Ms. Thomas, are you able to do roll or?
I did not bring your roster.
Okay, then I guess I guess I'll have to do it. Chair Brown here, Dr. Frazier,
Present.
Ms. Carpenter,
Present.
Vice Chair Mendez,
Present.
Mr. Watson,
Here.
Madam Mayor, most of the board's here with one absent member.
okay. Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. This is a joint work session between the Review Board and City Council. And next up on the agenda, we have discussion, but I did want to give an opportunity for the public to be able to comment at the beginning of the meeting also. So we'll open it up for public comment, and then we'll we have the PCRB interim meeting procedures as a discussion. So Mr. Will, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. If you're in the audience and you'd like to address council, please click the raise hand icon. Each person will get up to 3 minutes. First person up is Tanisha Hudson. Tanisha, you're on with council and the PCRB. You've got 3 minutes.
Good evening. Can you all hear me okay?
We can.
I really hope that during this joint session, we can address some of the issues that has occurred in this city, mainly with the current chair of the CRB, members of council, and the latest firing of the police chief. We really need to get to the bottom of what occurred there. It stinks, and it stinks really bad. It looks really bad on this city. We're in the process right now, as a whole, right now, this city, a trial is happening right now on Main Street that already makes the city look horribly bad. And then we just terminated a police chief. We've been through several city managers. We've seen only Black leadership get persecuted in this. Just everything about this city right now just screams racism. And what's bad about it is that you have Black people participating in white supremacy right now. That's not okay. So I hope that this work session definitely picks a little bit at what has happened here, because it's not okay. The role Bellamy played is not okay. The role members of council played is not okay. The role the PBA played is not okay. And you all owe it, not only to Brackney, but you owe it to this community to be open and honest and discuss it and be transparent about it and bring facts, not opinions. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if anyone else would like to address council and the PCRB, please click the raise hand icon. Mayor Walker, I don't see any other hands.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Willer. Chair Brown, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, Vice Chair Mendez, you've kind of driven the ship here. Do you want to start off? Or?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, back here to overview. So what we have on the agenda tonight, and I hope we can do justice to it, is, as the commenter said, a way to move forward on police oversight. And the two items that I thought we would be worth discussing were first the interim hearing procedures, which are currently sort of on a critical path to keeping us from hearing. We now have 2 review requests, and so I think we want to get that on the City Council agenda as rapidly as we can. In response to requests made by Councilor Payne and Councilor Snook, we amended that interim guidance to include professional hearing examiners who were experienced in civil rights law or some related area of jurisprudence to preside, to preserve, first off, expertise in the hearing officers, and second, to facilitate due process and to make sure we didn't miss anything legally. The second issue I was hoping to discuss tonight was the proposed the proposed ordinance for going forward with the Police Oversight Board, which hopefully we can rename. And my personal goal here is to get the interim hearing procedures in such a shape that they can more or less immediately go on the council's agenda. And I think working with Councilors Payne and Snook that perhaps we can get that done. And then also for us on the board to answer any questions and concerns that the council has about the proposed ordinance. And we've sent that out with our agenda package so that if we want to go through section by section and whatever level of detail, we can respond to your questions. Before we go forward, if I could just take one more minute here to call to the council's attention some recent developments. Given that we have our new executive director, a very bright guy and a very energetic guy, has been leading the charge on screening and identifying complaint management and investigative software packages for use by the Oversight Board and in fact by Internal Affairs. He and I and the representatives of Internal Affairs attended one demonstration session, and during that period I asked the head of Internal Affairs, what they wanted for Christmas, what would be the most important thing that they thought that the board or the council could do for them, and their response was, we need a new complaint management system. And the systems that we are looking at, which range in cost from $0, if we are going to be a beta user, to $8,000 or $10,000 a year, really make it a lot easier to manage complaints, to transfer information between the board and the Internal Affairs. And I think that those, whatever if we were to choose software like that, that would make a huge difference in our ability to communicate back and forth and organize complaints and investigations. So with that, I guess I would like to hear the City Council's reaction to the interim hearing procedures.
Mr. Vice Chair,
Sorry.
I do see Member Carpenter's hand raised.
I beg your pardon.
Ms. Carpenter, you're on mute.
One of the things that wasn't quite clear before we get into our discussion from our last monthly meeting was the duration of these hearing examiners. I was under the impression that it was going to be sundowned very quickly and was not going to be a long-term model that we were going to use. So was I incorrect in that understanding from our last meeting before we move forward with some council comment?
If I can respond, when we made that amendment to the, when we all approved that amendment to the interim hearing procedures, there was only one complaint. There's only one review had been received. Now we've received another one. And if that goes forward, I guess the hearing examiner provision would apply to that one as well. In terms of going forward under the new ordinance, we have not discussed that.
Thank you very much for that. I know I voted for it so I could get to this platform, but I wanted to, there was some consideration about duration. Since we just had at that time the one complaint that was hanging out there and needed to be processed through our procedures. Thank you.
And Consul, I don't know if you have any remark. I don't know whether you can comment on our second review request. Is it clear that it's actually going to go through review? I mean, I guess it is since somebody requested one.
Good evening. Yes, right now we did receive one review request. We just need to speak with the chair as to how he would like to proceed with it under the current ordinance, or if it's something that's going to be considered under the new ordinance. So.
So you're muted.
You're muted, Bellamy.
There you go.
Sorry, Vice Chair Mendez, I do see Councilor Hill and Member Watson with their hands raised. I don't know if we are going directly into discussion at this point or if they have time to. Okay, Councilor Hill.
I just wanted to just raise that my understanding with what you all sent for the interim procedures that council has received well in advance and looked at, and I think has expressed support, but obviously we will discuss this. But I am under the impression, and I've confirmed with our legal counsel, that we could vote on this today and just have this be done if there's not a concern with doing so. It certainly has gotten enough public attention already through the PCRB. So I just wanted to raise that as an option since there is a sense of urgency here. And we would like to have you guys set up for success for your next meeting in order to keep moving forward.
Great, thank you, Councilor Hill. Mr. Watson.
Yeah, good evening, everybody, by the way. My question goes back to, you mentioned the software, because, currently we have the PDF complaint form, which, we all know that everybody doesn't have PDF capability. And it could be a turnoff for somebody who wants to file a complaint. Since Hansel has been looking into it, do the software products that are out there, that they allow anybody with a cell phone to just jump on their phone and file a complaint and get some kind of a notification that they filed a complaint?
Yes, they're very, there's a lot of different programs out there, and a lot of them do have that ability. And some of them even have the ability for complainants to track real time what's going on with their complaint, whether it's been received, is investigated, and who has it. So I think that's some of the features that we see out there.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Mendez, the floor.
Let's see, Bill's muted.
Bill, I think you're muted.
Did someone ask me a question? I'm sorry.
No, I said the floor is yours now for the discussion portion.
Sure. So I'm willing to answer we are, as the board, willing to answer any other questions related to the interim hearing procedures. And I certainly welcome the suggestion by Councilor Hill that if the council is satisfied with the procedures as they stand, if they wish to approve them tonight, that would be a very, very good positive thing.
Are there any questions from any of the councilors? Yes, Vice Mayor McGill.
I'm just curious, what training does a hearing examiner normally have?
I missed part of your question. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bill.
I don't mean to jump in. We discussed with Councilor Snook and others, how this and Hansel, how this has been done in other venues. And the response was that there generally are a whole bunch of retired judges around who are willing to act as consultants and sometimes as volunteers, and that there are a number of options. I'm not sure exactly how you get volunteers, but Councilor Snook suggested that might be a possibility.
Councilor Snook, I see your hands raised.
Yeah, after some further reflection, my thought was that it would not be a good idea to have a retired judge, simply because there may be a perception that that judge may have some previously expressed concern or interest in one side of the issue or another, that we would be better off to have an independent hearing examiner. I know that there was a suggested language sent around. I was trying to pull it up just a minute ago that called for, there are in fact certain lists of people who do hearing examiner stuff, and they're typically, but not necessarily, they're typically retired lawyers or people who have been lawyers at some point and have moved into this as a full-time kind of thing. They're usually pretty experienced at conducting hearings. So my only point is, I'm not sure it's a great idea given public skepticism of the judicial system in all of this. I'm not sure it's a great idea to have a retired judge, and I'm sort of backing off from what I had said a couple months ago to Dr. Frazier and to Mr. Mendez.
Mr. Aguilar, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yes, and I apologize. I had some information that's hot off the press, but I did consult with our city attorney, and we, in anticipation for this being adopted, and we talked about how that would look like if we procure the services for the hearing officers or examiners. And she actually has some recommendations regarding that. Virginia Code already has a process for administrative hearings. And if she could just explain a little bit more and some friendly language that she has to amend the hearing officer's language.
Good evening. When Mr. Aguilar and I spoke, it occurred to me that the Supreme Court of Virginia maintains a list of what they call hearing officers, but they are a group of people who preside over administrative proceedings at the state level when things are subject to what's called the Administrative Procedures Act or Process Act. And so there's a list of qualified hearing officers, but more important in the Virginia Code, there are 2 or 3 statutes that set out what the qualifications are. The primary qualification is that they be an attorney and have 5 years of experience. But there's also a statute that deals with conflicts of interests and things that might disqualify a person from hearing a case. And so if you all were interested in using those state standards, it would be very easy to quickly set you up with a local list of people who could possibly meet those same criteria and follow those same conflicts of interest standards. And if what you're looking for are people who are attorneys, those the arrangement of legal services is not subject to competitive procurement. So what you could do is set a list of criteria, and you could just maintain a list of people who are willing to do it. And when you have a hearing, until you decide what your longer term procedures are going to be, when you have a hearing, you could select from that list of people according to who might be available on the dates that you'd like to use. But Mr. Aguilar has a reference to the state standards that I provided to him when we were talking about this. But as I said, the beauty of it is that we could set this up pretty quickly for you.
And my next question would be, how much is the recommended budget for this part of the budget?
Well, we don't know how many hearings there are going to be. And so this would be I suppose that it would be a one-time charge against our current fund allocation. And it really depends on how much, we tried to ballpark, what it would cost. But it's very hard to say that we would get away with less than $1,000 or more than 10. So for a single hearing, and I think it would be closer to the mid-range. Yeah, maybe Councilor Snook has a better understanding than I do of that.
Councilor Snook, did you have something that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say my sense of things, having been involved with professional mediators, typically a cost for a mediation would be in the neighborhood of $2,000, $2,500, somewhere around there. Just as Mr. Mendez, I'd be very surprised if it exceeded $5,000 in any particular case, though obviously they do things by the hour, and however long people talk, that affects how expensive it would be.
Ms. Carpenter?
You're muted.
Slow hands to the mouse. The question I would have is the amendment that we put in our hearing ordinance indicated that the city manager would have a process under city code to solicit for the hearing examiner interests of people out in the community. But it sounds like that portion of the amendment, if decide to go with this slate of already listed examiners that have done this type of work or similar work or whatever, but does that change the language of the amendment that we adopted at our last meeting?
If you utilize lawyers so that what you're seeking are experienced attorneys who can preside over your hearing, then you wouldn't need to do a procurement. But with Mr. Aguilar's assistance, what you need to do is very much like what the state does, which is you need to set up a list of people who would be interested in doing that for you, so that you could call them when you have a hearing and determine whether or not they're available.
Mr. Watson.
Hey, to maybe go along with what Sina was asking, my one question is, does that come out of our budget? And the other thought is, do we need to basically start looking for those people now? Do we interview a few of those people? And I'm trying to think, I have a third question. Thought I had a third question that came out of that. But do we have to interview them ahead of time to get a good feel? Does it come out of our budget? And basically their role is to facilitate, my understanding, the hearing. They're not, we weigh in on because I don't know if the public really is aware, as we're talking about this role that, we will determine sort of whether misconduct took place, and that my understanding is this particular role helps facilitate that particular hearing or meeting. That's kind of a question, or three questions, whoever can answer that.
Mr. Mendez.
Yeah, if I can respond. Yeah, it's our money. And the second question was, and the second, also, yes, the hearing examiner presides, but does not decide. So he or she is somewhat like an administrative judge, and we are still making the findings, that is the members of the board. So it's not like we're giving away our powers to someone from outside of town. So, and let me also let me review what the language of the proposed amendment says. And it said, and perhaps the city attorney can comment as to whether she thinks any changes are needed. The relevant section is hearing examiners will be engaged by the city manager as prescribed in section 2-56 of the Charlottesville Municipal Code. In selecting hearing examiners, the city manager will consult the executive director of the oversight board and will take due precautions to avoid bias, conflict of interest, or the appearance thereof.
Councilor Snook.
Yeah.
And I would just add to that I think it would be, I would strongly recommend against any thought that the PCRB, a PCOB, I guess we would be calling it, members would interview prospective hearing examiners. There are, if you wanted to get into something like where you're assessing who the person would be and making some substantive determination of that. I mean, there are ways you can suggest a list of 3 people and then see if you can get agreement on who the person would be. But at some point, I think just recognizing that this person is not going to be making the decision, all that they're going to be doing is making sure that things flow, that the rules get followed. I would leave that perhaps to your executive director in consultation with the city attorney or some other people, but leave it to the executive director primarily.
Vice Mayor, I'm sorry, Ms. Robinson.
And then I just wanted to note that in speaking with Mr. Aguilar, I'm not sure that the reference to City Code 2-156 is the correct one. It's the code section that allows the city manager to undertake investigations and inquiries. And so I was a little bit curious about why you all preferred the word examiner over officer. So I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what this person would do. I think you can create this list of people, whether you call them examiners or officers, but we do need to be clear that it sounds like what you want is just a presiding officer, not somebody who themselves is going to take on your role to ask questions and inquire into these matters. And then, however, let's see, I think that was my primary comment that I sent back to Mr. Aguilar was, I don't think the reference to City Code 2-56 is the correct one for what you're looking for, but I don't think I think as long as city council is approving your procedures and this is referenced in there, I don't think you need that code section.
So if council were to approve that tonight, would that section have to be amended? And if so, do you happen to have what that amendment would be, or that section would be?
I think, let's see here.
Would we also need to change the word examiner to the word officer then?
I don't particularly care which word you use. I just, when I saw the proposed language, the reference to examiner combined with that reference to the code section made me curious about whether you wanted that person to be an active participant in your hearings, but it sounds like you don't. But as long as that's clear, I don't care if you prefer hearing examiner over hearing officer. I don't think that matters so much. You have to be clear about what the role is. And here's the language that I would suggest. And this, I sent this back to Mr. Aguilar on Monday, I guess. Let's see, hearings is paragraph H in one of your sections. I can't remember which section it goes in, but hearing examiner. Okay. Hearings that are convened to address complaint review requests under section 2-461 of the board's enabling ordinance will be presided over by hearing examiners with professional experience in mediation, labor, civil rights law, police oversight, or other relevant areas of jurisprudence. Hearing examiners will be engaged by the city manager, and the city manager will establish a list of hearing examiners who shall have qualifications and shall perform their duties in accordance with state laws governing administrative hearing officers consistent with Virginia Code 2.2-4024 through 2.2-4024.2. And that sort of brings in those standards so that you don't at this point have to draft your own sort of code of conduct or what have you. The state law sort of sets the basic ethical parameters and disqualification requirements for you in those code sections.
Vice Chair Mendez.
Yeah, I have absolutely no problem with that friendly amendment, and it's at this point it's an amendment made to the council and not to the board. So I don't think we would need to vote on it twice. I may be wrong procedurally. And in terms of the terminology, hearing examiner, this was purely sort of a cosmetic sort of aesthetic judgment. Hearing officer, was thought to raise the idea that it might be a policeman in very simple terms. And so we decided to use the term hearing examiner at the behest of one of our board members.
Yeah, it would just be a lawyer.
I'm a lawyer, yes.
So if we were, again, if council were looking to approve that tonight, we could substitute that section, Ms. Robertson, okay. Are there any other additional questions or comments on the hearing procedures? Where is this? Councilor Snook.
Yeah, I've got a number of questions, and let me say, first of all, I don't know that it matters at all whether we call them hearing officers or hearing examiners. But if there is a particular language that triggers something in particular in the state code or in the Virginia Supreme Court procedures or something like that, it might be useful to use that. I've got a number of questions that I don't completely understand how you all think that this is going to move forward once the hearing is scheduled. And maybe you understand, and maybe I'm just trying to be difficult. In your paragraph 3, under investigation, for example, material from the city police department, the written record shall include material from the city police department, which would include a complete copy of any internal affairs investigation file and so on. Is it the intent that that file would be available to the PCRB in the hearing, that it would be that portions of it would have to be sort of admitted or proffered or identified as being relevant? Is everything that's in the file going to be deemed to be sort of admissible, so to speak? If there are affidavits or statements in there, would those make it unnecessary for somebody to come and actually testify? What's the expectation for that record?
I mean, I can just very, very quickly. This language sort of parallels what's in our current ordinance, that we will get access to an internal affairs file in support of a review request. And there's nothing much else in our ordinance that the one other thing in our ordinance is that we are all going to hold this information confidential. And so question 2. No, you go ahead.
So I mean, it sort of blends in then to my under paragraph 5 for conduct of hearings, where paragraph C, 3 little i's, the PCRB and the parties may call witnesses or seek to introduce documentary or other evidence not already part of the written record. That sort of presupposes that the written record is in fact admitted, that it is in fact in front of you all for the hearing without anybody else having to do anything more. Is that what you all intend?
I believe so.
Okay. Would there be a possibility, and I'm not pushing this, I'm just, and this is, some people do it this way, that they would have, that witnesses could appear either live and in person, or they could submit a written statement or an affidavit? Any thought about that?
I think
go ahead. Sorry.
I think the affidavit part, we ran into the question that, or the issue of the board not being able to take oaths or give oaths to folk in general. So I think that part became an issue there.
So does that mean you do want affidavits admitted, or you don't want affidavits, or?
I think that that would mean, we have, notification requirements, and if people wanted to file statements and affidavits, that I can't imagine that we would not accept them. But I don't think that necessarily we would submit them, and we would require them.
I mean, one of the things any hearing officer or hearing examiner is going to say, okay, you want me to apply the rules. What rules? And at this point, we don't have any really set out, except for the few things that appear under paragraph 5C. And the only thing that really relates to the conduct of the hearing is this one paragraph that says the PCRB and the parties may call witnesses or seek to introduce documentary or other evidence not already part of the written record. The PCRB shall determine the order in which parties shall present evidence.
Well, section.
I'm sorry?
Well, section 1A at the beginning says meetings shall be conducted in accordance with Robert's Rules of Orders or such other procedures as the PCRB may adopt. I think that would encompass any rule structure for the hearing flow that the hearing examiner or officer could utilize.
Well, Robert's Rules of Order doesn't tell us things like, for example, do you want the witnesses to be sworn? It doesn't tell us whether the record comes into evidence. It doesn't now.
Sure, and the latter part of that, it says, or such other procedures as the PCRB may adopt.
Which is kind of what we're working on right now, I think, right? Or is it your thought that the PCRB would be able to adopt them on the fly as the issue comes up in the hearing, or what?
Well, I think it's as necessary to make the hearing commence. I wouldn't envision that this would be, oh, we're going to, adopt new rules every week. I think it would be standard when they are adopted. But I think we would have a better understanding if any issues arose during the hearings of what would be necessary in that rule structure.
Okay, when you say any PCRB adopted procedures shall control, the ordinance provides that PCRB procedures are to be approved by council. Is it your thought that PCRB adopted procedures would not be approved by council?
No, I think it's pretty clear that that all the procedures are going to have to be approved by council.
Okay, so I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if that's the case, then we need to specify here with council as many rules as we think would be necessary to provide a hearing officer some basic sense of how he or she is supposed to be doing the job.
Yeah, and if I can interrupt here, we also have bylaws, and the bylaws, I believe, are a little bit more have language related to review request hearings and the procedures that shall be used. And Lloyd, we did discuss some of these issues in our 2-on-2 meetings, and I think it's necessary to keep some sense of perspective here that this is one hearing, and it's not a hearing that involves something that really terrible had happened, and then so this is not a perfect document, and we know it's not a perfect document. It's an interim document. We discussed that the record of the hearing would be whatever oral testimony was presented. So I don't know how much farther we want to go tonight. How much how practical it would be to dot all the I's at this point. And I'm sorry if that offends the legal sensibilities here.
Well, okay, here's another question for you. Would the written record be available to the complainant?
Well, it certainly could be FOIA'd by the complainant. So in fact, yes.
Well, so that brings up sort of your FOIA issue and the need for a policy that addresses, the internal affairs files are still exempt under FOIA.
Yes.
And so I think that, ultimately one of the things, so, the way I read these procedures, the Civilian Oversight Board would have those files and would make determinations of what portions of those files should be relevant to the questions before you. But you do have in the procedures, up in section 4 on page 4, you have some presumptions. You address how parties and witnesses, you address whether or not certain prior conduct would be considered. You address, you reserve to the PCRB, which I think could be delegated to a hearing officer, the right to determine whether something is relevant to a question in front of you. And then you also say that the rules of evidence might not be binding, but they can serve as the basis for arguments. I think that would also give a hearing officer something to work with. But I do think that part of what's missing here is a concrete approach to how those records are going to be used and how they're going to be shared. And I don't know whether Mr. Aguilar has any wisdom from his time in Fairfax, but there's
prior to Mr. Aguilar, Ms. Hudson, if you wanted to comment.
Thank you, Chair Brown. I just wanted to give some sense of perspective from the assistance provided in drafting the procedures in consultation with the PCRB and with the city attorney at one point. And with respect to the overarching question of the role of the written record, which is the investigative file essentially from the police department, the idea is that, and obviously it's up to council as to whether or not that continues to be the idea, is that the written record as an internal affairs investigation file of the police division maintains its integrity in terms of its confidentiality, except as may be available to third parties under the Freedom of Information Act, which, as you all know, is on an extremely limited basis. So with respect to that aspect of this, the interplay between the language that Councilor Snook cited about provision of the written record by the police department to the PCRB at the initiation of a hearing, and the matters about whether or not they are actually evidence in the case, is not so much that it's evidence to be made available to another party, but this is an expansion on that investigation. And the hearing is going to adduce evidence that the parties may put forward either through their oral testimony, through additional documentation, through additional witnesses, that supplements that record for the board's consideration, but not that the internal affairs investigation file would necessarily be laid open to the parties in the hearing. Now, keeping in mind that this is a hearing involving the conduct of a police officer or a civilian employee of the police department, that record or much of it is available to that individual anyway under FOIA. It's a personnel record for them to some degree. Obviously, there are parts of it that are not available to them, but there is much of it that is, because it's about them. So we can't lose sight of the fact that to the extent that the offending or the allegedly offending party is an employee of, and the record relates to that employee's performance, there will be some disclosure to that individual of necessity, certainly at their request, because they'd have some accessibility to it even outside of a hearing. The question regarding affidavits and whether testimony or evidence by affidavit is permissible. One of the issues that was raised repeatedly in the public comment to the PCRB about these procedures was the need, as a matter of due process, to be able to cross-examine witnesses. And to the extent evidence is permitted by a witness solely by written affidavit, it negates or diminishes that opportunity for cross-examination. So the procedures as written, or as in the thought of the drafting process, was not that testimony would be by affidavit, but would be or tennis or orally in person, hence execution of the subpoena power that the Virginia Code gives to the PCRB. So once again, I just wanted to put some context around the questions and hope that that's helpful.
Mr. Watson.
Just thinking to myself that we're in good shape because we have Ms. Hudson on our side.
Yes.
Forgot what I was going to say. I wanted to ask Mr. Aguilar. We were talking, Lloyd was kind of, bringing up, if I understand correctly, the fact that, this person that we hire as a facilitator is going to have some kind of operating procedures that they abide by. They're going to have to know how to facilitate this. What are the bounds? What are the rules? And so I wanted to ask Mr. Aguilar, if I'm understanding all this correctly, if you all had a person fulfill that role in Fairfax, and if so, did they have a set of procedures that they perform their job by? Thank you.
Okay. So, and again, this is a big difference in terms of the body that we had there. We were operating under the prior law, and now we were very careful with the usage of the word hearing. So we didn't have hearings, we had meetings. And the review request meetings were, the purpose was to review a completed IA investigation for thoroughness, completeness, and impartiality. And we allowed the individual to, the complainant, to explain why he felt that the investigation was incomplete and what he would like to see. And then we invited the police department to provide their review of the case and information about what they did in the investigative process. We would then deliberate and put forth our findings as to whether it was complete or not. In here, you're using the word hearing, and it's just very intentional, and it's a different procedure, as you were saying. So the Fairfax process may not be the best parallel, but the one in DC is a little bit more closely related to this process. And in fact, it's very similar to it. In DC, we were the investigative body, or in the civilian side, we also had the ability to investigate. And we didn't have the ability to make a final determination within the investigation office that something was misconduct. We sent it to the complaint examiner, who held the hearing, and within the hearing, they would adjudicate it as misconduct, or they would then say that it was dismissed as a complaint. So I just wanted to make sure that those that I was explaining that correctly about the differences and similarities. So in Fairfax, we as a panel, we ourselves conducted our deliberations in our meetings, not hearings. But in DC, there was a complaint examiner. There was a procedure, operating procedures for the complaint examiner. And this is something that Ms. Robertson and I spoke about, potentially crafting out what that process could look like, so the complaint examiner or the hearing examiner could have more guidance as to what we would like for them to do here.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't know if that's a showstopper. You know, we might be able to get a copy from DC to your contacts of what they have and see if we can adopt that. But I don't know if that is a all out, you know, hold us back for another 6 months type thing. Not that anybody's saying that, but I'm just, you know, putting that out there. Thank you.
Councilor Snook.
Yeah, so I guess the basic question, sort of the underlying question here is, to what extent do we see this procedure as the complainant versus the officer, as opposed to the PCRB versus the officer? In other words, does the complainant have a lawyer of his or her own? Does the complainant receive copies of the evidence that, or a copy of the written record? I'm trying to grapple. I mean, I can imagine very different scenarios as to how this may all play out, and I'm not seeing the answers in what we've got here so far. You know, is there a confidentiality requirement on the part of the complainant if certain information is made available, either during the hearing? Of course, it's a public hearing, so there wouldn't be any confidentiality in the public hearing. But I'm thinking, if it's truly intended as the complainant is an active participant in this and not merely the PCRB doing the investigating at the complainant's request, then there are a lot of other procedures that flow from that, like the access by the complainant to the information, like the complainant having his or her own lawyer, like confidentiality requirements, and so on. So I'm really trying to figure out which model are you pursuing here?
Miss Hudson, did you?
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Watson.
Well, you know, just kind of thinking about what the beginning, what Lloyd said, we're not taking a stance necessarily, you know, until we hear all the facts, right? Because I think you were saying, you know, is it us versus the police, or police versus us, or anything like that? So, you know, whatever we do, however we move out, you know, we're non-biased, right? As we're going into it, even though our goal is to make sure that people aren't being taken advantage of. But I do believe that, you know, an officer can have a lawyer present. But what I was thinking is I was maybe Bellamy had that in his mind too. I was going to maybe get a take from Ms. Hudson on some of what Lloyd was just speaking about.
Well, I wanted to, I mean,
Certainly.
so I guess before you do that, I mean, in drafting this, because I mean, I was the primary drafter here, the idea was that this was a mechanism to create an atmosphere for the complainant to present his or her case against, you know, the police officer. Part of that, when we go into the investigative, you know, file and all the other things, that would be the body of knowledge that the board in this case would have prior to, and it would be, you know, a verbal here, verbal with the complainant, verbal with the police officer, and there's obviously this section in there for the introduction of stuff that's not in the written record. And I think that's the most, I guess, streamlined and way to have it done, where the board's the adjudicators, but the complainant still makes his or her complaint against the police officer. And I believe I don't know, Miss Hudson or Bill, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say that the section 2 clearly states that parties to in the hearing can have representation. So, I mean, that answers that question. And it specifies that, you know, with the approval of the board, there can be cross-questioning of witnesses. So I don't know whether that answers sort of the question. There is, I don't think, any provision that the entire IA file would be made available to the complainant.
There is.
Oh, there is? To the complainant?
Oh, I'm sorry. No. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there is. Am I missing something?
I guess section 1 says a complete copy of any internal affairs investigation file.
To the complainant.
Regarding the conduct or matter that is the subject of from the PCRB. No, that's going to go straight to the PCRB. So yeah, you're correct. There is no direction to the complainant.
Yeah, and this is you know, something of a hybrid procedure, so I can see why people would have you know, questions about it. That's not unprecedented or too atypical for oversight bodies to act in this way. Sort of the idea is to allow complainants, a forum for complainants to be able to speak in disagreement with findings of IA investigations and to present their own opinions as to why that's wrong.
Ms. Carpenter?
I think maybe my question has been answered, but I was questioning the investigative file and how a complainant can prepare for a hearing if they don't have, all the information available, to them so that they can prepare, and also in case there has to be a cross, and perhaps has been answered and I missed it, but that was my question.
Cynthia looks like she's itching to say something.
Not quite itching, but I'm certainly certainly willing to say something. And it's that I think it's important to hark back to the posture in which these matters will come before the board, and there are a couple of ways, more than one. One is in its capacity as an investigator of complaints that are referred to it, where perhaps there has not been an internal affairs investigation yet, so, or at least not one that's complete, because the board has taken it upon itself to supplant the role of the police department in investigating the complaint on its own. So it's an investigative situation, and they're gathering evidence in order to come to a factual finding about whether or not an officer or civilian employee committed misconduct of some nature and that's one posture. The other is indeed the complaint posture, where there has been an internal affairs investigation. That investigation has concluded the complainant is not satisfied with the disposition of it and invokes the procedure under the ordinance implemented by these procedures to have that finding of the internal affairs investigation by the police department reviewed by the independent police civilian oversight board. And that's where the back and forth and the issues regarding the record, because in that circumstance, a record has been developed. And it's very much akin to the kind of record that has been developed in the course of a civil trial or other trial, where a matter, evidence has been collected, whether it's from both sides or otherwise, but the complainant certainly has given his or her evidence as to what they believe constitute the circumstances of misconduct. And they're free to put that on again, possibly to supplement it. And as far as the officer or employee is concerned, they too, in that circumstance, have also had the opportunity to be interviewed and to have given statements that constitute a record. And now all of that is going to be reviewed. The procedures allow for additional information to supplement that, allows for the parties are the complainant and the officer or employee accused of misconduct or alleged to have engaged in misconduct to speak directly in person, in addition to what they've already said in the investigation. And once again, the Police Civilian Review Board is in a fact-finding mode. They're going to determine whether or not that misconduct, whether it's more likely than not that misconduct occurred, and in the form of a determination as to whether or not that officer or employee is exonerated or whether the complaint is founded. And then procedures flow from there, depending on whether we're operating under the current ordinance or the ordinance that has been proposed to be amended by council. And that might contribute to a little bit of the disconnect here, is that these procedures are drafted with the current authority of the board in mind, as opposed to the authority that it seeks to expand by way of amendment of the ordinance. So we're kind of in this netherworld a little bit with respect to the nature of the authority that the board presently has versus the authority that it seeks by way of amendment. So again, just some general principles to keep in mind as you think about what's been proposed.
Councilor Snook.
Could I ask Mr. Aguilar for his experience with how this has worked either in Fairfax or in DC, as far as what information the complainant gets? Does the complainant have access to the IA file and so on? How has that worked in practice for y'all?
Sure. So in Fairfax, where we had the review model, we didn't have hearings. Again, we had meetings. The complainant, what they received was, well, they had their complaint and they had the disposition letter, and that's how they made the basis for their review request. And that's something that actually we worked in. One of the policies that we were able to work with the police department is to be able to provide more transparent and thorough disposition letters. The complainants, a lot of the questions and we saw somewhat of a change in pattern when the letters got more transparent, because the complainants understood what the police department did. So they didn't need to request a review. But when they said, oh, we investigated, found no misconduct, then they had all sorts of questions. But that's the only thing that they had at the review request meeting. They would come forth, they would say, this is what I experienced. Was my complaint, and this is what the police told me. And sometimes at these review meetings, the complainants there would be the first time they learned about these investigative procedures that the police department took. And some of them even said, hey, if I would have known this, I wouldn't have asked for a review request. So I think that was some of the observations we made, but they didn't really have access to more information beyond that. But in improving the disposition letters, I think that the complainants were able to better appreciate what happened. In DC, there were instances where there was representation, and they did have a little bit more information and access to the investigative file and records. And also, if a body-worn camera footage was available, they would have potentially had the ability to see some of that body-worn camera footage. In Fairfax, they were still rolling out the policy, so they not all complainants had the ability to see the body-worn camera footage. But that's generally my experience of how these processes played out.
Do you have a sense of which one worked better, which one you would recommend we seek to emulate?
Well, like Ms. Hudson was saying, I think that because the board is seeking two or in hybrid models and two separate processes, I think you're going to create a situation where you're going to have two hearing processes or procedures. And I really very hesitant with the word hearing for review requests. And that's just by the tradition that from Fairfax, I don't, because it sounds similar to the current ordinance. It sounds like really it's somewhat parallel to what we did at Fairfax, but with these hearing procedures, it's a little bit more involved, which is fine. But I think that if you envision, if you adopt a new ordinance, you definitely want to be very specific about what type of hearing you're going to have, because I think a review request hearing is certainly different from the fact-finding adjudicative hearing that you're going to have, and I think that needs to be more evident here in these ordinances.
And this is a review hearing and not an investigative hearing.
Are there any additional questions or comments? Seeing none. I don't know what, I mean, Ms. Robertson, do you, I guess, could you, articulate a potential process for council to review this tonight and potentially vote on it tonight? Is that allowable, or?
It is allowable for them if they're comfortable with it. I think you all have placed these procedures in front of City Council, and under the new state law, the procedures are City Council procedures to be adopted. So if councilors would like to consider some amendments to deal with the issues that have been discussed tonight, they could certainly do that if they wish to do so, and then vote on it.
Madam Mayor, is that something that council would be interested in at this point?
Counselors, thoughts?
Well, it seems like there are still, well, there's just some things that are really like obvious changes that we've already discussed. I'm still kind of curious about just kind of the concerns that Councilor Snick has raised. An alternative to tonight is if there are some clear direction that we can give, then, we do have a meeting on Monday, and I realize, we're trying to, get materials prepared and our staff's pulling that together, but that would be the next opportunity the council would have to vote on this, so that you could kind of set yourselves up for being able to take action on it during this next month. But Councilor Schnook, I feel like there's still some concerns you have with just kind of gaps in the procedures, even for these first couple hearings this is just a transitional procedure.
Well, yeah, some of the gaps are things that we just have to sort of make a choice. So there's choose A or B, but choose one or the other, so that a hearing officer has some idea of kind of what's going on. The really fundamental question that I think needs to be figured out is to what extent the complainant is going to have access to anything in the police file. Is it simply you just the complainant shows up, the complainant says, here's what happens to me, and that's the end of it? And in which case it's really very difficult to do any cross-examination or anything else. Or do we want to construct some procedure whereby the complainant has at least some ability to take a look at the file, or to have an attorney take a look at the file, or something like that. So there's at least some opportunity for cross-examination, for meaningful engagement by counsel. And the two models, I mean, you can go either way. You can go, as I guess Fairfax did, essentially giving the complainant very little opportunity to do much, or you could go in the way that DC has gone, to create a little bit more ability for a lawyer, for the complainant to be useful. And I think we ought to choose one or the other.
Vice Chair Mendez.
Yeah, first off, I don't think I've heard anything hostile here from the council in terms of sort of a general desire to move forward, and I applaud that very much. If a modified set of guidelines were to be presented on Monday, embodying either of the options that Councillor Snook was considering, I don't think that would be a problem for me. So on the whole, I'm pretty encouraged.
And let me say, from my perspective, Mr. Mendez, you're absolutely right that I want to get to the finish line with a product that a hearing officer can implement successfully. And I say, let's choose one or the other, but let's understand that we're making a choice. That's all. I don't know how other councilors feel about it, or other members of PCRB feel about it.
Prior to Ms. Hudson.
Oh, I was just going to add with respect to two particular points that have been raised. And again, this is in keeping with the fact that presently the PCRB operates under the ordinance that enabled it and created it in 2019. And in that ordinance, it is still effective. It specifically forbids the PCRB to take evidence under oath. So the issue about whether the testimony will be sworn and that kind of thing is addressed there. So it'd be inconsistent for these hearing procedures that are just supposed to operate in this, again, this interim, this transitional period, to require testimony under oath. The other piece is that with respect to the role of the internal affairs record and information obtained from the police department, that ordinance provides specifically for the complainant to receive information about this in the following way. Upon the completion of the individual filing the review request presentation, in that circumstance that it matters before the board, a CPD representative familiar with the internal affairs investigation that is being reviewed by the board shall present a statement which summarizes all findings of fact and a review of all evidence collected and received during that internal affairs investigation. The Police Civilian Review Board may ask the CPD representative questions about the investigation. So in that circumstance, all parties are hearing that summary at the same time and have access to the information that's been collected by the police department in that fashion by operation of the express ordinance language. So again, I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that.
Very well. Vice Chair Mendez.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mr. Councilor Snook, did you?
I just want to, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, Ms. Hudson, you're reading from section 2-461. I guess it's subsection, I don't know, C or D or somewhere in there. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Subsection D.
Okay. Thank you.
Vice Chair Mendez.
Well, I'll just point out also, I think that what Ms. Hudson said kind of summarizes the extent of the authority that we've been given. And so even if we wanted to to go further than that under our current ordinance, it would be probably legally difficult for us to do that. Also, in terms, if we're worried about, fairness and due process, the board is going to see the IA files. The board is going to see the evidence. And if there are concerns about the quality of the investigation or concerns about whether something happened in a certain way or another way, we are going to be aware of that issue and we can raise it. And the complainant can also raise it during the hearing. And so, it seems that under the 2019 ordinance, the onus kind of falls on the board to be the representative there and to bring up whatever they see as potential shortcomings in the investigation.
Mr. Watson.
So if we're primarily focusing on at the moment the one hearing that goes back to the complaint from I think it was June or July of 19. No, June or July of 20, based on the current ordinance that we have. It seems like what Cynthia said kind of answers all of Lloyd's questions. But in addition to that, I mean, I haven't seen the IA file, but literally the whole thing is on videotape. And the chief was open and played the videotape. And there's multiple, I think, Instagram videos of that particular incident. So there probably really isn't a whole lot beyond that that's out there for that particular situation. I know we have 2 of these, and I don't know if the second hearing would be under the new ordinance once that's approved. But remember, I think about 90% of everything seems to be on the videotape. Thank you.
Councilor Snook.
I was just noticing again, and Ms. Hudson, you may correct me if I'm reading this incorrectly, that paragraph C of the, was it section 2-459 or whatever it was, the access to materials provides that the board will receive a copy of the file. Each board member gets a complete copy of the internal affairs of file subject that is the subject of the review request. The city attorney shall review the file and redact any information related to a juvenile and so on. But then at the hearing, there does not appear to be any provision for information being given to the complainant except during the review hearing, at which, and where it has the language, upon the completion of the individual filing the review request's presentation, a CPD representative familiar with the internal affairs investigation that is being reviewed by the Police Civilian Review Board shall present a statement which summarizes all findings of fact and a review of all evidence collected and received during the investigation. And the PCRB may ask the CPD representative questions about the investigation. Is it the expectation then that the complainant would not receive access to the internal affairs investigation report except through that CPD officer's summary? And is it the expectation that while the PCRB may ask the CPD representative questions about the investigation, the complainant would not? And if those are the results, if that's the correct interpretation, is that what we want?
Well, your reading is certainly the same as mine, Councilor Snook, with respect to the manner in which the complainant receives information about the file. It's in that summary. And the hearing procedures attempt to give the complainant the opportunity to ask questions about that report by including this provision that states that the parties, which would include the complainant, may submit written questions to the board to pose to the witnesses. And that would include CPD witnesses and would include questions about what they've heard about in the summary of the investigative file.
That's a procedure that is somewhat similar to what I'm familiar with at the University of Virginia for Title IX hearings and things like that, where there's not actual cross-examination, but you can submit a question. I also know that under the Trump administration, they tried to roll back some of those policies. So I'm not going to necessarily go there, but this is a sort of a philosophical question of which way are we going? And if the answer is that we're going to a relatively scaled back view of the complainant's ability to sort of prosecute the case, then this makes sense. If somebody wants a more expansive view of the complainant's ability to prosecute the case, this doesn't get there. Is that accurate?
And I would just, yeah, I think, again, not being the lawyer, as I say, I think that your reading of the black and white letters on the page is perfectly accurate, and that that may be the model that is, consistent with the 2019 ordinance, and it would be very hard to go any further than that. Remember, we are going to be redrafting our operating procedures for the new ordinance as well, and a slightly different model could be adopted at that point.
Ms. Robertson?
I also just want to point out that at the top of the 4th page of your procedures, there is a provision that's built in. Now, again, this particular provision will depend on there being sort of a good relationship among all of the various parties, but there is a provision in here that allows for a person to make a FOIA request for certain records or personnel information. And what this procedure says is that that request will be referred to the FOIA officer, and then the chief of police will determine whether or not a particular request would be released. So for example, in a given situation, if somebody said, look, I really think, to prepare my case, I need a copy of the body worn camera footage. There is a mechanism in here for that to at least be considered. And I think that while, ultimately in a set of procedures, it might be better to be more specific, but I think until you all get started, it's really difficult to lay out, for example, a list of documents that would need to be shared or that sort of thing. But I just want to point out that that's there. So there is a mechanism for that type of request to be considered in a given case, but it is not as precise or direct as some of you are talking about.
Very well, thank you. Are there any additional comments or questions on the hearing procedures? Are we looking, Vice Mayor McGill?
Yeah.
So I just reading through some things. The one thing I want to, if somebody comes forward and something to be looked at, and let's say they have a personal relationship with somebody on the civilian review board, either positive or negative, would that hurt? I don't see anywhere. I mean, we're a small town and it's easy for someone to be related to somebody or somebody to know somebody well who might bring forward a complaint. Does somebody need to recuse themselves or anything? Do we have anything like that?
I don't believe that there's a recusal or a mandatory recusal piece or recusal piece at all within the procedures themselves. I think there is that thought has been presented, but it hasn't gone into black and white at this point. Vice Chair Mendez.
I'm just going to say we had at our last board meeting proposed a code of ethics and rules of behavior that included, conditions for recusal, and but under for this interim procedure, no, there's nothing there. There's nothing in the 2019 bylaws or statute related to that.
But something like that is being considered for the code of ethics that's coming that's being worked on?
Yep.
Are there any additional questions or comments? So am I correct in understanding that this is going to be pushed for council consideration to Monday as opposed to this evening?
Councilor Hill, you proposed that, but what do you think would be resolved by Monday that isn't resolved tonight?
And it's fine if everything is resolved. I just, if there was anything notable changing, I just knew that this current version with some minor tweaks, we were okay with, could go tonight without any kind of public opportunity for weigh-in. But if what we're saying is not viewed as like transformational, then I think there's no reason to not act tonight. I was just giving, if there's gonna be a lot of changes, I think it's just important to kind of give the public, even if it's just a few days, an opportunity just to digest those changes.
Okay. I didn't know that there was a vote tonight until you mentioned it at the beginning of the meeting.
Yeah, I just was sensing the urgency coming from PCRB, so I just asked Ms. Robertson, like, is there anything precluding council from taking action? Because Lloyd had just acknowledged also that this is something that they just wanted to be able to move forward on so that they could hear this one hearing that's been outstanding for some time. So I was just trying to help them expedite it if it was just minor things, because this has definitely gotten plenty of public look through the PCRB, and council's had it for some time.
Okay, councilors, in terms of the first item tonight, are you all comfortable with making a motion there?
Mayor Walker, let me just say, I'm as the source of a lot of the questions here. The way that the questions have been answered suggests to me that the version that we've got in front of us is probably a fairly good way to proceed under the current ordinance. A lot of stuff would have to get changed before we would consider it under a new ordinance. Of course, we haven't passed a new ordinance yet, but I think that given that we've got an ordinance right now that clearly contemplates a very limited role for the complainant in the proceeding anyway, a lot of the questions I have don't make any sense. If we're going to go with that limited role, then what we've got here is fine. And I may have, a couple of grammatical things, but I'm not going to hold it up over that.
And I think that the city attorney would like to change that last sentence in section 1H to fix the procurement procedure for the hearing examiners, which I consider to be a very friendly amendment. I have absolutely no problem with.
Well, do you want to just figure then that we will get that part right by Monday and we'll pass it Monday?
Very well.
Does that sound reasonable, Ms. Robertson?
And I would suggest we put it on our consent agenda.
I can work with Mr. Aguilar and Ms. Hudson, and we can get that taken care of. And I just verified, does everybody want to stick with hearing examiner? That's fine if that's the preferred term.
Unless there's some reason why it matters in whatever list you would be consulting.
I don't think it does. We're referencing the state hearing officer sort of criteria, but I don't think that means we can't call the local office, the local person something different. It's just incorporating a reference to standards.
That's fine.
So, Ms. Robertson, this is something that you're suggesting we wait till Monday? Because normally,
I'm okay either way. Whatever you all would like to do. If I can read the language again, if you wanted to act tonight, you could. I can read that language that I read earlier in the meeting back to you again. Or I can just work with everyone to prepare a final document that has the exact language in it and present it to you on Monday for adoption, either on the consent agenda or as an addition to your agenda at the end.
I would like it as an addition, so I won't have to pull it.
That's fine. The language
That'd be
that we're talking about is the citation to section 2-156, which you say is probably not the right section. So either
That's
we take
right.
either we take out the citation completely and just say as prescribed by the Charlottesville Code, or else we come back on Monday and you fill in the right answer.
I don't think we really need a reference to the Charlottesville Code. If everybody's in agreement that we'll use attorneys and reference the other additional language I was recommending was reference to the state statutes that set out the standards that the hearing examiners would need to comply with in terms of disqualification or that sort of thing.
I think that's a good idea. I think that's a good idea to add.
So, but yeah, I can work with Ms. Hudson and Mr. Aguilar, and we can get something in front of you that you can add to the end of your agenda on Monday.
All right, thank you.
That's good to me.
I have a question.
Vice Mayor McGill, okay.
Quick question, and I don't mean to interrupt, but since I haven't seen it yet, how long is the Monday's agenda? What do you have on there that might take a substantial amount of time prior to getting to that last piece on the agenda, in case there are members of the public that are on this work session now that might want to weigh in at some point, regarding that, or listen in even. Just curious.
Well, I guess my question is, like, how much more discussion are we going to have that we aren't already having on Monday?
I would suspect not much. I suspect just a matter of getting the I's dotted and T's crossed.
And that relates to Ms. Carpenter's question, is like, I would think that most of the discussion is taking place right now.
I'd like to thank the city council for putting this on their agenda. So a good step forward.
I would like to ask Lisa again, does this need to be a showstopper? It may feel a little bit like, feels a little bit like the can is getting kicked down the road a little bit. If the I's aren't dotted, T's aren't crossed, whatever. How big are we talking about? The one piece about the procurement for the hearing facilitator, or what?
No. In terms of the hearing examiner, the primary edits are to edit out a reference to section 2-156 of the city code, and then to add in some language about the state standards that administrative hearing officers or examiners are required to adhere to. There's some qualifications, such as they must have a certain amount of experience as a practicing attorney and that sort of thing. We would be editing out some language that references, due precautions to avoid bias, because the state standards that I'm suggesting you incorporate by reference into the procedures deal very specifically with when a hearing examiner would have to disqualify herself or himself due to not being impartial, or if they had some connection to someone. So with some fairly simple edits, this is ready to go, is what I'm hearing from counselors.
I think so.
Is there a concern with it being on the consent agenda, Mayor Rocker?
I'm just probably do it from consent, so we can just add it to the
I'm just trying to understand, like, is there a question though that, like, why you would pull it?
No, I don't have any questions. If we are gonna vote on it, then my vote is probably gonna be different from the four of you.
Oh, you just want to, you mean a separate vote?
Yeah.
But could it go on consent and pull for a separate vote? I'm just thinking about Ms. Carpenter's point about if people are thinking that we're going to have a broader discussion on this, I don't want to tie them up the whole evening because we've just discussed
Oh,
it.
yeah, I don't think that there was any discussion. It seems to be consensus with you all.
Do you have specific concerns?
I don't have any that I wish to share at this moment. So it's not to discuss anything. It's just for the vote. When you said consent agenda, I'm just acknowledging that I'm probably gonna pull it.
Oh, okay. I think there was a confusion that you wanted to put on the action item. So I just want to make sure the staff is clear that we can put it on the consent agenda, but it will probably likely get a separate vote.
All right, that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry, go ahead, Madam Mayor.
Yeah, no, the next item was the proposed.
Yes, and for the proposed agenda, I will turn the floor over to Vice Chair Mendez.
Thank you again, Bellamy. We have sent out with the agenda package an outline for of the proposed oversight ordinance that was forwarded to you in August. And this document that we sent out just has a couple of bullet points for each of the sections with the important provisions in each. And I don't have any plans as to how I would want to discuss things. And I think I'm just ready to answer questions from the board, from the council about, specific powers or specific items in the proposed ordinance that are of most concern. The idea being that we can move forward as quickly as possible. I know Councillor Snook, for example, has asked, some specifics about the, the procedures and conditions under which the board would do investigations. And, people may have concerns about that, or the review procedures, or who gets to see complaints, or, the procedures for disciplinary recommendations. It's really over to you.
And there's obviously been a lot of, over the last few years, like a lot of conversations around some specific issues, but I think that how the complaints get handled has been a very consistent theme. And when I'm looking at just the summary of feedback that Councillor Snook provided, it's really on this kind of front end in terms of vetting of the complaints and verifying, just how far the complaint, might go in the process in terms of just, is this really something that we should be acting upon? And so I think that those are really good starting points for us to discuss, like, what is that happening on that front end to determine the validity of that complaint?
Yeah, sure. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, is that me again? I actually sent Councillor Snook some responses to his comments. I'm sorry, I didn't share them all around.
Oh yeah, I have his outline. I don't have your.
Yeah, no, I also sort of the background for the issue of who receives complaints and what happens is when the complaints come in the door. I think that discussion has been transformed by this tentative decision, and I think it's an ongoing decision. I think it's going to happen of the police, the IA, and the civilian oversight or review board choosing and agreeing on a software package for the receipt and management of complaints. Each, the options, these are very time-tested and rather polished software package that we've been looking at. They've been designed to address the question of multiple users who have access to different sets of information. And so the idea they handle complaints either electronically or by being scanned in. They essentially they elicit from the complainant whether they were a victim or a witness or whether they're acting as a representative. And it is entirely possible to share complaints or selected fields from the complaints if it's thought necessary to separate them simultaneously with the head of the Internal Affairs Division and with Mr. Aguilar. And so that obviates a lot of the board's concerns about whether we are actually going to get to see all the complaints that are filed, because we will see them. And that way we will be in a much better position to know the dimensions and nature of the complaints that we're getting. In terms of vetting, as I said, the input procedure will take care of some of this, will provide some of the data for vetting, figuring out whether this complaint actually involves the Charlottesville police officer. And I have no problem with the submitting of a complaint having an automatic follow-up call go out immediately or within the next 24 hours to further elicit whatever information is not complete. And I think the implicit problem with vetting is standing, and I may be wrong with this, but I saw Lloyd's head come up. So I think that's probably the issue. And one of the things that will be considered in the new operating procedures is who has standing to file a complaint. And we have not discussed that in any detail right now. But my thought is that it would be someone who is directly involved in an incident, their designated representative in writing, or a witness. And so, I don't know who else you would want to exclude. Given the fact that Hansel and Lieutenant Moore and the chief have simultaneous and immediate access to a complaint, this vetting process and the decision as to who is actually going to undertake the investigation, these decisions can be made in an informed and collaborative way.
Are there any additional questions?
I could just point out that, two of the outstanding questions in my mind are one of them that Michael Payne has raised and that we have discussed internally, which is what is a serious complaint or what is a serious allegation? Because under the new Virginia code, we only have authority to have any disciplinary input for a serious complaint. And so that does need to be resolved. I could refer you for an example of such a set of conditions to the Fairfax County governing documents, where they have a specific list of items that might fall under the purview of being serious misconduct. And we can certainly add or subtract. And to reassure Councillor Snook again, we're going to stay away from allegations of criminal conduct because we don't have any authority over allegations of criminal conduct. The other big issue is what would be the criteria for the board to elect to investigate a complaint. And I think those would be a little bit different from the criteria for seriousness, something that needs to be spelled out in the operating procedures. If you look at some examples from around the country, like I think Oakland, California, if I'm not mistaken, it's basically a combination of the seriousness of the alleged misconduct and the degree of public concern. And so I think that is the kind of criteria for investigation that you will see as we move forward on the operating procedures. One of the, a suggestion that has been made is that for the time being, the best thing that we could do is to have our executive director simply oversee the internal affairs division very closely. So that Mr. Aguilar would be, in constant contact with Lieutenant Moore and would be making suggestions as to why haven't you interviewed this person, and what, why can't we see the full camera footage from this person, and so on. And that way, to assure that the internal affairs investigation is complete, and Lieutenant Moore, excuse me, that the investigation is complete and unbiased, and so that we won't really need to ever do an investigation. I think that the criteria for doing an investigation will be pretty narrow, and I think that in the meantime, in the early going, as the Internal Affairs Division updates how they manage their evidence, and as we develop collaborative procedures, it may well be that that's what happens in the case of most investigations. But I think it's still very important that the board have the authority to, take an investigation unto itself, whether it's going to be conducted by the executive director or by an independent investigator.
So there is support for this current board to allow for the ED to oversee, partner with, CPD would conduct the investigations. They would kind of oversee that. And then there'll be certain threshold of criteria by which the board might want to pursue its own investigation, but that would be pretty limited. The goal is to kind of leverage the existing resources that are already in place. Is that what I'm hearing, Mr. Meadows?
Yeah, basically it is. And we're trying to balance, among other things, the resources, as you say, and maintaining as much the appearance and reality of independence as necessary. And Hansel is a very smart guy, but it may be that there are expert investigators who have dealt with a specific kind of case, in which case we would want to get involved.
Councilor Snook?
Thank you. Let me say, I have been suggesting this notion that we rely on the executive director to sort of supervise or to look over the shoulder of the internal affairs investigation. because I think that's a very good compromise that keeps us to where we're only having one investigation. The notion that we would have two investigations of every complaint, I think is kind of hard to deal with. But and obviously we could still have a second investigation if the first one was inadequate. But I think as a practical matter, if the executive director is speaking to the internal affairs investigator and says, have you talked to this witness? And the investigator says, nah, I'm not going to talk to him, forget about it. That's not going to happen. If the ED says, why don't you talk to that witness, the internal affairs investigator is highly, highly likely to go talk to that witness or go ask the additional question that needs to be asked. So I think that that's a good way to get started. The question that I have overall, and this is not a problem unique to this ordinance by any means, but it's sort of characteristic of the issue as it comes from the General Assembly, is that on the one hand, we are not supposed to be investigating cases that involve criminal conduct, civil actions, civil lawsuits, and so on. On the other hand, we're supposed to be investigating serious offenses, serious breaches of departmental and professional standards, which various people have defined. I guess Fairfax talks about unlawful arrest. That's certainly a civil action. Excessive or inappropriate use of force can be a civil or a criminal action. Unlawful or inappropriate search or seizure would be a civil action. Use of abusive racial, ethnic, or sexual language or gestures certainly could be civil, and some circumstances could even be criminal, and so on. So, and then we look at the definition, just use a slightly different version, is Alexandria's definition of severe misconduct. It's all basically, then these being the things that we would expect the PCRB to be investigating: use of force and severe misconduct and incidents resulting in death. Well, I think it's highly likely that any incident resulting in death is going to involve some allegation of either criminal or civil action. I'm just trying to figure out, as a practical matter, where do these exclusions leave the PCRB something meaningful to do? What's left? And I guess maybe Mr. Aguilar can tell us from the experience in Fairfax what kinds of things they actually wound up hearing and deciding, and what kinds of things came under their ambit, because I have a hard time figuring this one out.
Well, maybe sorry if I jump in here, but the ordinance does, the board cannot anticipate if a civil action is going to be filed. So the proposed ordinance requires the board to cease investigating if, after consultation with the city attorney or its own counsel, there is a civil action that is underway. In terms of investigating criminal activity, I think we again have to take our guide from the powers that be in terms of whether there is an active criminal investigation that is ongoing. In terms of, and that's all I can say. I mean, 99 times out of 100, if we're talking about failure to provide service or rude behavior or using a racial epithet, well, no, we're not going to be worried about criminal activity. And if the individual wants to sue the city or the individual policeman, then we get out of the way, but only when they file their action. In the meantime, that falls well within our purview. In the case of a situation where where there is alleged misconduct independent of criminal action, I think there might be parallel investigations of the same incident, but not the same allegation. So if somebody gets arrested for, for breaking and entering, and they're a defendant in a criminal trial, but they maintain that when they were arrested, the following week, they were mistreated by police, then that would fall under our purview too, because that has nothing to do with the ongoing criminal action. So I'm not sure that this is as hard a obstacle course to navigate as it is made out to be here.
Mr. Aguilar.
Yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit about Fairfax and DC. So in Fairfax, we had the hybrid model of the independent police auditor. He handled all force-related cases, and he was the paid staff member for the county. And he was a use of force expert. He had just retired from the FBI, and he taught use of force at the academy there, very well credentialed. And what we had the opportunity to review as a panel was anything essentially not force related. So it could have been discrimination, abuse of authority, discourteous conduct. And there were also sometimes where we might have had joint jurisdiction, so to speak, if it was a use of force that alleged discrimination. We would not look at the use of force, that would be the independent auditor. We will look at the discrimination element of it. So in my recollection, we probably had only one that comes to mind, but that was something that kind of a joint feature. In DC though, we had the opportunity to investigate both use of force and anything else, any violations of law or general order. I would say though that when there were use of force cases, we didn't investigate the criminal part. We would do a preliminary investigation, take the complainant's information, review body-worn camera, and do a summary, and then send that over to the U.S. attorney, who would then investigate it for criminal misconduct. Once we received the file back in a declination letter that they were not going to prosecute, we would then have the authority to investigate violations of the use of force under the general orders of the police department. So it wasn't that we didn't have any authority to investigate use of force. It was just we did not focus on the criminal element of it. And that's the Garrity issues and reverse Garrity came up with those matters. But I hope that kind of explains the differences in how we handle the cases.
So if there is a declination letter, as you refer to, then that would help us to understand when it was appropriate for you all to move forward. The one concern, I guess, just thinking about a civil proceeding, as evidenced by a notice of claim, which may be filed under Virginia law a year later, or under a filed complaint, which may be filed 2 years later. I guess if there is some, I'll tell you what I'm really kind of concerned about is the idea that that somebody could use the PCRB process as a tool for discovery, where perhaps different rules might apply from those that would apply in court. That if for whatever reason we end up creating a system that allows the complainant to have access to information that he or she may not have access to, if there were a judge saying, basically reviewing a subpoena request or reviewing a request for production of documents or something like that. And I haven't thought it through in detail to know whether that's really a serious issue. But again, I don't know, Mr. Aguilar, did you all ever have the sense in DC that's what was going on here, that turned out to be a problem, this tension between the civil complaint or possibility of a civil lawsuit not yet filed and the police investigation?
So ironically enough, we actually saw it more on the police side because, and this is where we informed individuals that they have the right to an attorney, but we did receive there were some instances where the police would try to FOIA information from the procedures to potentially use in their criminal procedures. So
That's interesting.
Yeah, and maybe I could just, again, I'm big mouth. You know, we have, sort of not due process, due process requirements that are required before we can subpoena anything. We have to make good faith efforts to compel evidence or testimony. And, again, this is something that's going to happen. It's going to happen very rarely. It's something that the General Assembly had, in their wisdom, granted to oversight boards. And if we have a legitimate reason to need to see a document, I don't think we should necessarily worry, that somewhere down the road that might have discovery implications, because we're trying to do justice just like everybody else.
Any additional comments or questions? Vice Mayor McGill.
Thank you. This is in section 2-453, item A, subsection 4, where the no police civilian board member shall be a current City of Charlottesville employee. I would really love it if we could maybe take the opportunity, or if the board would take the opportunity to potentially narrow that. We've had some very good candidates for the Civilian Review Board who worked either in social services or driving a bus. Candidates who wouldn't necessarily, I don't know if this section is in there so that there's not some sort of conflict, but I can understand not wanting somebody in certain departments necessarily to be on the Civilian Review Board, but do we also want to somebody who might be working part-time at Parks and Recreation? Is that how wide we want to limit people from being on this board?
You're not the first person to raise this issue, actually. And I'm certainly flexible in terms of expanding the membership issue. I'd have to, obviously the board would have to discuss it as well. And as you say, as long as we had, provisions in there for avoiding conflict of interest, I don't think that would be a problem.
Was that the, yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Was that the rationale, Ms. Robertson, for whoever inserted that provision, was the conflict of interest question? Because I agree. I mean, I think it excludes a lot of talented people that that might otherwise be appropriate members of our board.
I think I necessarily participated in the drafting of that particular provision, so I don't think I can speak to that. I think that in general, at least under the state Conflicts of Interest Act, unless I don't think a city employee, for example, in the Parks Department is going to have a financial interest necessarily that would disqualify them from serving on or making decisions on the Civilian Review Board. But it's interesting. You do have a provision in the ordinance that suggest that there can be some mediation, and I think depending on whether or not, I don't know, I don't think the Conflicts of Interest Act necessarily precludes it. I think there could potentially arise some weird iterations, but I don't think in general, someone who's an employee outside the police department would be precluded from serving.
And to the vice mayor's point, I mean, is this something council would be willing to give us some wiggle room on or consider?
I think when this was being discussed before, the thought was a person in the field of law enforcement. And so the individuals who have applied since then have not been. And it's been hard, as you all know, to even fill the non-voting chair for law enforcement. So this is something we have discussed as, because we've had some good candidates apply that couldn't because they were in other, departments.
Ms. Carpenter?
That's a good question, because I don't recall the historical reason why that was done. I kind of would like to hear from, someone that was on that inaugural board when they were discussing that section of, eligibility. Was it because of concern about someone either being a former employee in law enforcement in some capacity, whether on the street or, some other capacity, or whether, what that concern was? Because I think it's a good question, because you're right, we have had, issues with seating some people recently. And, if there is a concern that can be, if there is one, maybe I'd like to hear it. If not, I mean, I guess we could open it up. I don't think I would particularly be hesitant to go along with opening up that particular category of folk.
Yeah, based on how hard it is to get volunteers, I have to agree with that.
Are there any additional comments or questions? Mr. Aguilar?
Just a general comment, and I've seen it in other boards. I think it's really about the appearance of a conflict and the optics of having city employees be part of this process. It's kind of an independence thing. The more that you have individuals within the city involved in this process, it may give the appearance that they're not being as impartial as they could. So there's an optics thing there, but there also maybe some laboral considerations. If an employee is part of the board, then now you have to have guidelines as to when they can participate in these proceedings, and are they going to be able to do it while work on a case while they're supposed to be on duty. So I wouldn't want any of my peers to be in a situation like that they want to participate, but then they may be in a situation where a supervisor may not work with them. So it's, if you allow that, there has to be some guidance as to what they can do on duty or not. But as a general statement, I think, and I've seen it in a lot of places, just the optics of having county or city employees be part of the civilian review board may give the appearance that there's some involvement by the city, or too much involvement by the city and county.
So we would need to move cautiously.
Are there any additional comments or questions? Councilor Payne?
A lot has been discussed, but a couple specific things.
a smaller thing, but is there any process or anticipation that'd be useful out of process for referring a complaint you receive that involves an officer that isn't with CPD, whether it be sheriff, university police, if there will be any sort of set process for referring that case or figuring out how to handle it?
There is not, well, there is not now, but there certainly could be. And depending on what software the UVA police or the Albemarle County Police are using, we might even be able to use some automated file transfer. So yes, that's a good idea.
Well, the statute, I'm sorry.
I guess the way that it's currently worked now is either contact has been made with the respective policing agency. The most recent, it was again presented to CPD, and I believe Lieutenant Gore had reached out to UVA police to kind of work that out. So I don't think it needs to be codified, but if the cross every I or whatever, dot every I, cross every T, that's fine. Counselor Snook?
Yeah, there's an interesting problem under the statute. 9.1-601 paragraph C provides that a law enforcement civilian oversight body established pursuant to this section may have the following duties regarding any law enforcement agency established within the boundaries of such locality. So that would seem to permit oversight of the deputy sheriff, perhaps. I'm not sure it would apply to the University of Virginia Police Department, since I'm not sure that they're established within the boundaries of such locality. On the other hand, I look at paragraph 1, and it says that the board will have the authority to receive, investigate, issue findings on complaints from civilians regarding the conduct of law enforcement officers and civilian employees of a law enforcement agency serving under the authority of the locality. And I haven't thought about whether serving under the authority of the locality means the same thing as established within the boundaries of such locality. But that's the sort of the degree of nitpicking we would have to get into to get an answer on whether we would have the ability, whether you all would have the ability to review, for example, the conduct of a university police officer who was conducting an arrest in the city of Charlottesville pursuant to their concurrent jurisdiction agreement. I don't know the answer to that.
That is actually addressed within the statute. If you look at 9.1-601A2, it says, for the purposes of this section, a law enforcement agency serving under the authority of locality shall be construed to mean, and then it goes on to say, any campus police departments of any public institution of higher education of the Commonwealth established within such boundaries. So I think that, at least on the surface of it, the statute does seem to contemplate that a campus police department might be included. I think that, established within the boundaries would need to be language that I suppose would need to be interpreted.
My quick observation would be that the University of Virginia is not technically within the boundaries of Charlottesville, and so the UPD is not established within such boundaries.
Yeah, that's why I say it may not be entirely clear. It depends on, the university property may or may not be considered City of Charlottesville property, but if you're looking at the territorial boundaries, perhaps the answer comes out differently. So it's not entirely clear, but I just wanted to point out that the statute does specifically reference campus police departments. And so it's not entirely out of the question.
And if they're operating under the MOU that they have with the city, then that should be something that we should be able to discuss.
Well, as I said, the language in the statute that would have to be sorted out is whether or not the university campus police department is, quote, established within the boundaries of the city of Charlottesville. That would be the language that would have to be sorted out, both from the perspective of, you know, is the campus police department established within the boundaries of the county, or within the boundaries of the city, or within the boundaries of neither. It would depend on, we have to take a look at that a little bit further. But again, I just want to let you know that the statute itself does seem to contemplate that under certain circumstances, a campus police department could be within the purview generally of a civilian oversight body.
Vice Chair Mendez.
Yeah, I should just say that under, the current language, it doesn't assert any authority over either the sheriff's department or the UVA police. As I understand it, our General Assembly representatives understand that this language is kind of ambiguous, and there were going to be some technical changes made this year that was going to clarify it. So maybe, this may become moot fairly soon.
Mr. Wheeler, could you promote Delegate Hudson so that she can have a word?
Thanks
Delegate
very,
Hudson. Yep, go ahead.
thanks very much, Chair Brown. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to affirm the last comment that it was absolutely the intent of the legislature to consider campus police in this process. And to the extent that our delegation can be a partner in clarifying that further in the upcoming session, we'd be very happy to do that.
Very well. Thank you, Delegate Hudson. Are there any additional comments or Councilor Payne?
Two other things is one, in your hearing processes, is there an ability for the complainant to appeal after that hearing process is complete, or is the determination at the end of that hearing process final?
Currently there is no appeal option in the hearing procedures. Bill, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Yeah, just to agree that in the interim hearing procedures, which you agreed to vote on Monday, there is not any appeal. B, the proposed ordinance does not also grant any appeal beyond, to the city manager or to the city council. But even that's not formal. That would just have to be something that the complainant would do. And on the other side of it, there is a general agreement that a police officer who is given some kind of discipline on the basis of a board recommendation has the right to the municipal grievance procedure.
Are there any additional questions or comments this time?
Other question I have is, I know in earlier drafts, I think the language seemed to have precluded the executive director's ability to have the authority to investigate. And one, is that still the intent? And if not, does it reflect that the ED would have the ability to do an investigation?
Again, you're not the first person to raise the issue. there are appealing features of having the executive director involved, leading investigations, like presumably it would be less expensive, and presumably he, in this case, would know the inner workings of IA. We want to preserve, yeah, and to answer your question directly, in the proposed operating procedures, I would think there would be a language that would allow the ED to conduct investigations on, to lead investigations himself. The issue is we don't want to overload him. He's got plenty to do. And B, in cases where we need special expertise or a very strong appearance of independence, we want to reserve the right to have an executive, an independent, truly independent outside investigator.
Councilor Snook.
Yeah, a couple questions. One, just a piggy little thing on the question of terms. It says each member of the board shall be appointed for a term of 3 years. Is it your contemplation, or do you have a thought on whether there should be term limits?
That's a new idea to me, and I haven't given it a whole lot of thought.
I mean, the planning commission, for example, 2 full terms. Obviously pieces of terms as well, but two terms. There are other boards like that we've got some term limits on. CRHA is another example. Anyway, okay, so that's something to think about. I'm curious about there's a provision in section 2, 459 A2 says that the Civilian Oversight Board may initiate investigations under any of the following circumstances. Paragraph 2, when a police department internal affairs investigation of a civilian complaint is not completed in 75 days and after consultation and so on and so forth. Within 75 days of what?
Of it being filed.
Of the filing of the complaint?
Of the filing of the complaint, and this is actually right out of, it's just the same authority we have now in 2019.
Okay. So when we talk about the complaint intake under section 2-457B, we probably, I mean, it's one place or another, we ought to make clear that the filing of the complaint triggers the running of the 75 days that is referred to in 2-459A2. Not a big thing, but certainly something. I also note in 458 that you've got 2 paragraph Ds, so we need to clean that up a little bit. Back to the question that we've discussed before, is that I'm looking at 2-459 paragraph B, and where it talks about the investigation and how the concurrent notice of chief of police, who shall ensure the police department's cooperation with the investigation in general. Are there things, and do we want to specify, if so, what they might be, that would remain confidential in some way? Or is it simply everything gets opened up? I'm thinking, for example, if there is an allegation of a sex offense that has been made, of course, presumably that wouldn't come before anybody because it would go to the criminal courts. But the way we're describing things, if somebody says, no, I don't intend to pursue that criminally, it might come back. Or obviously there are issues that are referred to a couple different times about dealing with juveniles. And I imagine there are other things too. I know that one of the issues that we have on our legislative agenda, and I see Delegate Hudson is still with us on this, that we really need to get the Freedom of Information Act figured out as it applies to PCRB proceedings, because this is something that crops up in many different places. One of the places it crops up is on the question of whether the PCRB, when it deliberates on the issue, does it deliberate in confidence in a closed session, or does it have to do so out in front of everybody. And there are a number of issues there that I hope that we can get resolved from the General Assembly. But back to the initial question, do we contemplate that there would be anything that we would want to have remain confidential at that initial phase?
Well, one of the things, the drumbeats that I've been hearing from our stakeholders is that the police have been extraordinarily tight-lipped, and they don't ever provide any information, even when there's no possible conception that this bit of information should be held confidential. What I had, again, I tend to come up with these very naive scenarios. What I thought we would want to do would be to have a sort of a systematic consultation with Ms. Robertson about specific elements of investigations regarding, which item, would be exempt from FOIA, which item is legally needs to be redacted, which item should be, does not need to be redacted. So we would have a sort of an opinion, from the city attorney rather than from the IA department as to what little bits of information should be free, should be open.
Let's see.
I think the one thing that I would like to point out about that is that this is another area where it's really important to establish a good working relationship with the police department, because those exemptions under FOIA are for the custodian of the records. And so that would be the chief of police. And unless city council directs otherwise, that discretion would stay there. And so, I can help sort of facilitate communications between parties. I can advise, city councilors as to what types of documents might not be the best documents to release, at least before you know whether or not you're going to receive a lawsuit. But in the end, I'm just assisting or counseling people. And so I would not want to step into the shoes of the police chief or the police department, but I do think that getting the FOIA issues straight is absolutely essential. And both at the state level and within whatever operating procedures will apply to the different functions of the board. And so I think that in your operating procedures, for example, if you're doing an investigation, those records generated would be your investigative records, and you would be the custodian of them and have those decisions. So it's going to depend on what category of authority you're exercising.
Okay, thanks. You just answered my question.
Are there any additional comments or questions?
Well, the other issue, I guess, that we talked about in terms of the procedures in the first half of this meeting, I'm still concerned about whether, again, because the new statute and presumably this ordinance under this new statute may lead us in different directions if we want to. I'm curious about this whole question of to what extent under the new version of things the complainant would they have any additional rights to access to information or anything else more so than they do in the first version under the first statute. This is a place where I think we have a little more freedom to get to where we want to go, rather than just because the statute is not as confining as our previous ordinance had been. So I'd just like to hear particularly from the current members of the PCRB, how you all envision giving, how much power, how much investigative role you envision giving to the complainant in this respect.
I think, I mean, my answer is that we're still thinking this through, and I thank you for making the stark choice that we face more clear. And it may well be that in our operating procedures, new operating procedures, we do in fact allow a more formal access to the IA investigation or aspects of the IA investigation. And it's something we need to work on.
Is it, is it possible to present the same or similar written narrative that the board is supposed to receive, which is out, which is, I guess, a codification of what the file would have?
Well, again, we're working out with IA, and we will need to work out with IA understanding about what the actual record, what the IA file comprises. And again, we've had complaints from stakeholders that even when they're given access to IA documents, that they're redacted or that they're incomplete or that they've just been totally refused. And so we need to work that out. And again, I hate to be, the sort of the technocrat, but if we do manage to implement one of these file management systems, this will make things a lot easier in terms of being able to share information, share it confidentially, and share unredacted information, between our two organizations. And so I hope that will make things a lot easier.
Vice Mayor McGill.
And Mr. Aguilar had his hand up first, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I just wanted to make some kind of romanticized comments about the spirit and the purpose of civilian oversight. There are some legal barriers that we may never be able to resolve, but I do believe that in having a board and a body that are peers of the community members that are having access to this and are deliberating openly and transparently, it gives the community a level of assurance that their matters are being listened to. So there are things that we may not be able to resolve in terms of access to information, but it doesn't mean that the board itself is not doing its function. They will have access, unredacted access to these case files, and they are going to deliberate openly about it, obviously to the extent that they can within the law, but they will review it and look for issues that can be addressed by the department and by city council. So I don't want us to, or the takeaway for any community members and anybody who may review this that, well, they're not getting access to the complete file, so what good is it? Lack of transparency. And in my practice and experience, it hasn't been the case. Even if a community member can have the full access to everything, by having a civilian oversight body, you can resolve a lot of these issues.
Vice Mayor McGill.
I was just going to say that it sounds to me that most of the issues that are being brought up are more about the development of the operations versus the actual ordinance itself. I know that's where most of my concerns are more about the how things will happen versus the power of it happening. And I really applaud you all for what you've been putting together and the work you've been doing. So thank you.
Mr. Watson.
A question for Mr. Aguilar. When you were doing this in DC and Fairfax, did a lot of the police officers end up just quitting their job? It
Jesus,
seems like in Charlottesville, almost every time we've had
what
almost a
the hell,
scenario.
James?
What's that?
Who cares?
What I'm saying is, it seemed like everybody's quit or gotten fired by the time it, kind of came to us. So I'm just kind of curious if that person tended to mess up so bad they knew it was over, and that was
Who cares?
and if somebody does quit, do they still have to come before us? Is there any
Yeah.
law?
Yeah.
Ms. Carpenter, I believe that Mr. Watson has the floor.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was unmuted.
Yeah, that's what I was just wondering how that works. If somebody says, hey man, I did wrong, right? And we have a hearing plan, but they go ahead and quit and leave the state or whatever. I mean, do they still have to come before us? Is there any teeth?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I
Anybody
thought I
know that?
understood. I thought I understood the question, and then it was a curveball. We actually did have officers that were but they left during the process of investigation, more so in DC than in Fairfax, and there were decisions made that was the end of their involvement with the case, but legally, I think there would have been avenues by where we could have subpoenaed that officer, even if they're not on force anymore. But I think those more administrative investigative decisions were made that individual officer wasn't adding any extra value, or the matter could be resolved without their involvement. But certainly with subpoena powers, I do believe that that's something. But I thought that the question was originally, was there like a mass exodus in having when these boards were established, and that was not my experience, that officers were just leaving left and right during the process.
Vice Chair Mendes.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the process of the IA process is any more transparent or seen as fair anymore by the officers now as it is by the complainants. And so again, as a idealistic technocrat, what I'm hoping is that we will be able to institute changes that will increase transparency for all all parties to any case. And B, once someone leaves, sort of that's the ultimate sanction. And it may well be that we can subpoena them back. But, other than that, we're working on administrative discipline, and we once they've gone, they've disciplined themselves.
Are there any additional
And
questions?
also, I should also point out that Chief Brackney instituted this procedure whereby she's was very aggressive about communicating adverse disciplinary findings to the appropriate accrediting agencies for police. And I hope that will continue, certification of police, and I hope that will continue.
Any additional, Councilor Payne?
Final two comments I have right now are just one. I think it will also be important to have in the ordinance just a clearly enumerated process for council removing board members that's tied to a code of ethics, and maybe within the operating procedures having that be internal for the board. But I think that will be important to just have enumerated and explicit in the ordinance. And the last comment I have is I just, I know there was some discussion of investigation pieces. To me, I think it's just really important that the board and what we adopt does maintain the authority to have independent investigations of its own. I know there was some discussion of the scope or circumstances, but I think that's going to be a very important power to have as a institutional check long-term.
Vice Chair Mendez.
Yeah, I just, again, we have discussed, boards, code of ethics and, rules for board members, which, variations of which I hope will be put into the operating procedures. I noticed that in the Fairfax operating documents, they have a procedure whereby the board itself can hear a complaint against a board member and then file a report with the county supervisors. So that's something we might want to think about. But that's only, down the road, that we haven't discussed it.
Are there any additional comments or questions on the proposed ordinance? Councilor Snook.
Mr. Chair, at the risk of sounding like I'm beating a dead horse, I would really like to have the benefit of your thoughts as much as possible on this question of what kind of a role we're talking about for the complainant, because I was going to suggest that, if we can get agreement on what these outlines would be, then final drafting of the ordinance and even the procedures under it may flow very easily. But if we don't have that basic agreement, it may be very difficult for those of us who are trying to work behind the scenes. I mean, one of the problems that Mr. Mendez and Dr. Frazier and Mr. Payne and I ran into was not being 100% clear on where everybody else was coming from, and therefore what did we really sort of have freedom to negotiate. And I'd like to have as much, even if it's just sort of thinking philosophically at this point, from you all whom I don't have a lot of contact with, as well as from other counselors who I might have more contact with, on that basic question. To what extent are we seeing this as a process where the board is in charge as sort of the primary mover and shaker, and to what extent is the complainant the primary mover and shaker?
Vice Chair Mendez.
Yeah, I again, in speaking with folks who have been involved in this process and stakeholders, the major, back when we started to work on the revised ordinance, the major concern was that there was no opportunity for complainants to be heard publicly by an independent, an independent, unbiased board. And so the goals of the procedures are to give them that opportunity. It's not a criminal defense. It's not circuit court. It's, a forum wherein, people who feel powerless can exert some power by speaking. And that's sort of my vision of it, and I can understand where there would need to be procedural details that need to be worked out, but that's where I'm coming from.
Are there any
other members of the PCRB feel?
I agree, Mr. Snook, with Mr. Mendez. I think that it's going to be very important in terms of both the uh, uh, process of the board and the optics of the board that be primary. That the voices that have heretofore felt that they weren't being heard are being heard, and that's clear to everybody involved. So that's speaking for myself.
I mean, I am along the same lines. I think it's the same thing that I'd mentioned earlier with regard to the thinking and the setup of the hearing procedures. There is the complainant presenting his or her case against the police officer. And I mean, as much involvement as he or she may need to do that effectively, uh, seems to be the right way to go. Obviously, that's going to take into consideration some of the privacy concerns and all the other legal matters that are surrounding that. But I mean, that's ultimately the ideal.
I would agree with what's been said. I don't think I have anything more to add to that. Thank you.
So, I mean, that's, I'm sorry. I guess we hadn't heard from Mr. Watson. I didn't want to step on him.
Yeah, I concur as well. I lost the signal a while ago.
Well, so I appreciate that because, as I said, it makes a difference in how we structure the rest of the process. If we have that basic philosophical sense that we are intending this process to be more, I don't know, more open, I guess, for lack of a better way to characterize it, than the first set of things. And I think that's right in terms of what the General Assembly was getting at. But I wanted to hear it, from everybody before we try to start figuring out what that's actually going to mean when we get to writing things. That was my reason for asking the question. Thank you.
Got it.
Are there any additions, Mr. Watson?
Yeah, I think over time we are going to have to look at what role we play over the university police. We all know there's going to be pushback, but we also know that the University of Virginia has basically encroached over time into a lot of different neighborhoods. And, we saw last year with Mr. Hoffman, you can be walking through part of what's considered UVA or the neighborhoods around UVA, and somebody decide, oh, they don't think you should be there. And, that could have negative consequences. And so, I don't think that, I know we're going to get a lot of pushback because UVA is the big elephant in Charlottesville, but I do feel like if a serious case were to happen, if they don't have a board of their own, then, people have to have somewhere to come to. And that could probably take forever to, make that happen. But, looking at the nature of UVA, looking at what I'm seeing at, 10th Street in different areas and how UVA is expanding. And I've seen it on a lot of different levels because I've been a UVA student and a Charlottesville resident. Excuse me, I worked on a UVA corner back when people were being swabbed for DNA. I had a lot of friends that were UVA students that, that happened to. I had a buddy that was getting off work at the bistro, Michael's Bistro. He was working, got off 2 o'clock in the morning, got into a cab to go home. The cab took him to the police station, not to his house. And he was swabbed by the police. So I do think that it's going to be difficult, but that's something we've got to keep in mind, that UVA, the city of Charlottesville, and some of Albemarle County, they all blend. I live in a neighborhood that's both city and county. So we definitely got to keep that on the horizon. Thank you.
Any additional questions or comments before a public comment?
If I may, and just where do we go from here? Do we, is it sort of like, do we do a markup session, with members of the council and go through each section, one at a time, or what is the best way to proceed forward, do we think?
I'd be happy to engage in a markup session with you.
Well, I guess we would have to get the approval from both of our respective organizations, but I
Understand.
I think that might be the best, next thing to do.
Okay. So Vice Chair Mendez, can we, what is this? I guess let you spearhead that effort with, it looks like the same work group, Councilor Snook, perhaps Councilor Payne, Dr. Frazier, and yourself.
I think Jeff has something to say.
Yeah, I was going to get to him. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Frazier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My only concern, and I've shared this with the work group, is that if we could make a pitch to council to fast track this, because I'm concerned if we have to start over the first of the year with 2 new counselors and their learning curve and all that they're trying to learn about being counselors, it's just going to kick the can further down the road. So anything we can do to expedite the process without short-circuiting the public comment or the necessary number of readings, I think would really be beneficial to the process. I'd love to get this done so we could get on with the business of our board. Thank you.
So we can set up a meeting, that's mutually convenient as soon as possible, I guess.
Very well.
I think it's certainly like the goal of council. I know when I was asked for the top handful of priorities that I had for the end of the year, it was just to try to get at least this ordinance passed. But we also have to be realistic about how much time we do have left, just in what remains in the year. And we certainly want to make sure that we're getting it right. I totally agree that having a smaller work group kind of hammer through some of these details is much more effective than trying to get all of us involved. And certainly, entrust that in 2 of our colleagues here, and then obviously all of us will weigh in as we see fit. But I don't want the board to think that it's not in all of our goals to get to that point. I just think that here we are at October 26th, and just the timeline of when materials have to be prepared for our colleagues and by our staff, and just there is stuff to work out through still. I mean, our first goal was to get this more interim procedure done, which I think on Monday we'll have that passed, hopefully. So that's one step, but I just want to make sure that we're all managing expectations, but I certainly hear, I think that's still our goal.
Okay, thanks.
Recommend when there are changes to the draft that they are noted and that they are also released to the documents that are released to the public, and that the public has ample time to comment on those changes and the draft overall.
Okay. We can start version tracking here.
Very well. It looks like the ordinance discussion has concluded. Madam Mayor, I guess we turn this back over to council.
Thank you. Mr. Willer, I'll turn it over to you to open up for the second public comment section.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. If you'd like to speak to council on the PCRB, please click the raise hand icon in the Zoom webinar. Delegate Hudson has raised her hand. Go ahead, Delegate.
Thanks very much, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for your work tonight and for all of this over the long haul. I know it's been a long time in the making, starting with the residents and organizers who raised the call for this critical work and identified it as a top legislative priority so that we could shepherd the bill through the General Assembly now almost a year ago, and of course, all the work that has followed since then. I know we serve the same residents and have all heard the consistent calls for meaningful civilian oversight of law enforcement. And I think that the ordinance that you're converging on now is a critical step in that direction. I just wanted to affirm again that it's absolutely the intent of the General Assembly to provide localities with the flexibility and framework that you need to implement an impactful civilian review board. So I hope you will continue to consider our legislators as a partner in pursuing any additional legislative clarity or authority that you need to do this work well. Please don't ever hesitate to ask if there's something more that we can give you to give you clear tools to carry this work forward. I hope that we'll all also continue to stay open and responsive to feedback from the public about what parts of this work well and what parts of it need more work as it continues to roll out. I know I will have my ears open to any and all feedback that we get. And lastly, I just wanted to really elevate the piece that Mr. Watson mentioned in his last remarks, which is that it really was the intent of the General Assembly, and in this case, I'm speaking for myself and my close colleagues, in understanding that in a lot of our college towns that there are porous boundaries between our university law enforcement, the cities and the counties, that those communities all intermingle. And since we are one Charlottesville, Albemarle, UVA community, we want to make sure that you have the authority so that any of our residents, no matter which of those streets they happen to be walking on, feels safe, and that they have the opportunity for accountable oversight as well. So if you need any additional clarity on that, let's please make that a priority for the upcoming General Assembly session. And perhaps Councillor Snook, since you're handling some of the details of the markup, and I think also on the legislative subcommittee for council, any attention that we can give to that in the run-up to session would be great. So please don't ever hesitate to get in touch if I can be a helpful resource in this. And thank you again for all your work, both tonight and in the many months that led up to this.
Thank you, Delegate.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Tanisha Hudson. Tanisha, you're on. You've got 3 minutes.
Well, I feel like what you all are doing is pretty much a rush job. You covered a lot tonight. You also talked about people being able to do the work of being on the CRB, without being impartial and without having a bias. You all definitely need to consider, even with all that you discussed tonight, members being on this board, being highly connected to speaking with individuals within departments, within the city, whether it's the city manager, the members of the police department, members of council, they should be held to a standard too. If you don't want board members handling a case because them knowing someone in the community, members on the board shouldn't be reaching out to members within City Hall in reference to situations. Like you have to set some boundaries and hold them to a standard also, because we've seen that, and I'm not going to let that go. And I don't care that that's not what you were discussing tonight, but what you're trying to do now, I know that Mr. Fogel has been requesting this hearing for quite some time. And it's almost like you all just threw some stuff together just to have something to be able to perform this hearing. That's unacceptable, because the next person that comes through with the complaint that's requesting the hearing, it could be totally different. And you're ready to put something in stone about a hearing process, and every single situation could be different. Every single one. So I know y'all trying to get some things done to make it look like you accomplishing something before you get off council, Heather. But this should not be a rush job. You all need to look at this holistically and understand that every situation is going to be different. So if you're going to implement something just to give Jeff what he deserves, that's one thing. But y'all trying to really put something in stone. And then you sit up here and you say people shouldn't do things impartially or with bias. Lisa's done it. Council's done it. Chip's done it. Mooney done it. Bellamy Brown has done it. You all have contributed to doing that. It's unacceptable. Take your own advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Katrina Turner, who will be followed by Rosia Parker. Katrina, you're on with council on the PCRB.
Katrina Turner. I'd just like to say that, as far as the FOIA and people having to FOIA their records, that's one of the problems, because people can't afford to FOIA the records. So, and if we come to you with a complaint I feel that everything that you have, since now the police department is releasing their information, why is it that you all will not release your information to, I'm not going to say the complainant, I'm going to say to the citizens, because the complainant just does not sound right. You know, sounds as if we're complaining about what's going on, but we're not really not complaining. We're letting you know what's going on in this community. So the word complaint, I really don't agree with. So I think that really needs to be changed, and I know that's been talked about. But Miss Hudson at the very beginning spoke about how we need to talk about the chair of the board and everything he has done and said, but not one person on the CRB or the city council has spoke up about the chair of the board and everything he's done. One of the most despicable things is how he talked about all the races that applied for the position of the executive director. You know, and for Heather, from what I hear, to be involved in all of this, that's a problem. So I'd like to know why it was overlooked about the chair of the CRB and everything he has done. And if anybody can answer that question for us right now, or whenever public comment is over with, I would love to hear that answer. Because this chair has tainted this PCRB. And one more thing before I go, I need to know who else in the PCRB is, you know, sitting, having lunch and everything with the PBA, because the PBA is a problem. And if you all continue to have a relationship with the PBA, that's a problem.
Thank you, Ms. Turner.
Thank you.
Next up is Rosia Parker. Rosia, you're on with council on the PCRB. And you'll have to unmute. There you go. You've got 3 minutes.
Good afternoon. Oh, well, evening. Going back to what Ms. Turner says about the chair. I'm not going to get on here. I'm not going to bash you. I'm not going to do anything like that. But that was completely wrong. What was done using the PCRB platform for the bias of the police chief. It should have been used on the complaints of the citizens instead of the police, because that board was created by victims of police brutality. Disadvantaged communities was created in that resolution. Everything was void in what you did by using that platform for the police. Not only was that the People's Coalition created the resolution was because of the people, not from just 2017, but from 400 years of Black people in slavery being harmed by the police. And it's been going on too long in Charlottesville. Myself and Katrina was the last two Black women of a whole bunch of people on this resolution. We have put in over 400 to 500 hours of work without the PCRB, of putting work in to make sure that this work goes through, and having an understanding of what we've been through 2017 and what these communities we watch people go through, the homeless people, how Black and brown people are treated. And Mr. Wells have abused myself and Ms. Turner, yelling in our face. What y'all saw from him wasn't nothing compared to what he did to us in public, especially myself. So listening to the PBA or whatever you're listening to, that is not the community, and you're not representing the community. But I've loved listening to what the new people are saying, because they're feeling what we have felt. So I just hope that y'all really do take y'all's time and really putting forth an effort and listen, put these ordinance and what we've done with legislating in the Senate and do right by the citizens from July 1, 2021, what we work for. I appreciate y'all's time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the next hand is Abby Guskin. Abby, you're on with council on the PCRB. You've got 3 minutes.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. I just wanted to, Mayor Walker, thank you very much. I just wanted to reiterate what you said to make sure that any changes go out to the public for review as quick as possible. The changes to the interim hearing procedures, that they go directly to the PCRB website, and any edits or changes to the draft ordinance as well. I want to also reiterate what Katrina and Rosia, being in many of the meetings from the original PCRB board members, and what they struggled through and what they deliberately tried to do for this community, so people had a safe space to go somewhere to air all their grievances. I just want to make sure that it's not tainted by what your chair member, the active chair member, Mr. Bellamy, has done to this community. It's just, it hasn't been well received in the community, and I also don't understand why he's still with us, but that's something that we need to continue the conversation with. Also, the wrongful termination of Chief Brackney and reinstating all the Black leadership would be a joyful thing for the city. Bellamy, Brown, Miss Heather, Lisa, Chip, and Officer Mooney and the other council members. It's just, there should be a lot of shame on their face, because what has been going on has not been resolved, and it needs to be resolved. Because since the CRB now and the PBA and Ms. Carpenter, I leave you and the ladies out of this scenario, played a role in her termination. We need to hold everybody accountable. And I just wanted to try and wrap up some thoughts that I've had this evening. And we need to just move forward to make sure our citizens in this community have a safe space. And what the first CRB tried to do, and all of the hours that they spent making sure that that happened, that it's not tainted because of someone just having big egos. And I appreciate, thank you very much for letting me speak.
Yeah.
Our next speaker is Ange Khan. Ange, you're on with council on the PCRB and you've got 3 minutes.
Great. I'm so glad to have both y'all together. One, I'm finding it really odd that no one has addressed, or not to my knowledge anyway, the chair of the PCRB collaborating with the PBA. I'm just wondering when that is going to take place, when that conversation is going to happen. How do you all expect, for those who believe in PCRBs, how do you expect members to have full trust in this current PCRB? It's just unbelievable. Like, every time somebody brings it up, is it getting addressed? It's not. So I would like to call for that PCRB chair, Bellamy Brown, to be removed. It's unimaginable. Like, how do you expect folks to actually believe in this? And all of the time that community members have put in to forming this, and then have a person come around and say, oh, I'm going to take it upon myself to just go ahead and have these conversations with folks and not see a problem with it until they're called out. So, I mean, that's something, that needs to be discussed. And I don't know when you all plan to discuss that, but if there could be a time and date for that, that would be great.
Thank you. Doesn't look like there are any more hands. You want to just do one more call?
Last call. If you'd like to click the raise hand button. And Teresa Hepler, you're on with council on the CRB. 3 minutes.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, this is Teresa Hepler. I'm an attorney with the Legal Aid Justice Center. I don't mean to switch gears necessarily because I think all the public comments that have come before mine have been very important. But I wanted to make everyone aware, including people who are listening, that it sounds like there has been some conversation earlier around the ordinance to potentially water it down. So the draft ordinance that has been presented under section 2-459, which is the investigations, allows the Civilian Oversight Board to initiate investigations when they find that it merits such an investigation. But I did hear a comment that wasn't discussed very much about, instead of having the board do an investigation, having the executive director kind of look over the shoulder of internal affairs. And so I just wanted to highlight that the community and voices that I have heard have been very concerned with the police investigating themselves. And there has been a big push to have independent investigations. And so what I'm hearing is more talk about ensuring that there isn't a power shift. And that's kind of been a theme that I've heard tonight in general, away from the police, which has allowed them to engage in the behavior that is the cause for so much of the community's concerns. So I just wanted to highlight that because I didn't want that to be missed. And if that does come up in a marked up version of the ordinance, I did not want that to be missed again. I would push for there to be further discussion among the public and the communities. If that's something that they actually want, if they do not want the PCRB to have that independent investigatory power, and instead they want the executive director to just look over the shoulder of internal affairs and let them continue doing what they've already been doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I don't see any more hands, Mayor Walker.
All right, thank you. Close the public comment. I'll just start off comment for Ms. Turner's, the question she brought up first. I did bring this before council. The behaviors that have been displayed from Chair Brown, which are now being claimed to have been private affairs, but I'm looking now at a August 18th post on Facebook where, you know, he talks about a meeting between that Mr. Mendez and he had with me that was a pretty good meeting, and claims that I did not follow through on that information. If there's only the will of one person to take that, take his behaviors over the course of months and look at them and determine whether he is a good fit for the board, then there's not much that can be done. I expressed my concerns multiple times through emails, through council and the board in response to Ms. Carpenter's initial email, and feel very differently than apparently the other members of council. So I just want to make it clear that I am not, I'm not going to keep bringing it up because it's clear that we're not moving forward with any changes, but I did bring it up initially. Are there any other comments or questions?
I'm just kind of curious, what do we see as our next steps from here? So on Monday, we'll be having in front of council this, you know, intermediate procedure so that these other hearings, this immediate hearing can be handled. Then it sounds like there'll be a work group that's going to work through some of the more detailed things that are needed and outstanding on the ordinance. And maybe we can just have that group maybe check in with all of us shortly thereafter. Obviously, the mayor's asked, we have all those documents that are marked up so we can see the changes that are made, as can the public. And I think at that point, we need to kind of make a decision in terms of when this may or may not be ready to come in front of council for a formal vote. Is that kind of where we are? And then from there, after that's all done, then the procedures will be developed, but that's certainly going to be in the new year.
And that was one thing that I've been consistently asking for, and I still would need to understand the how this happens, and to make sure that the people who would be able to execute, especially the independent role that they have been expressing, not just with this board, but with the former board. And I understand why, but with that kind of, you know, power, it would be helpful to make sure that everyone understands the processes. And I'm not sure that that is clear. Any other comments, questions? No? All right. Well, just in terms of the board, we have 4 meetings left and you all have 2, I think. So just to just make sure that it's understood, I would very much like to be able to vote on this before I leave, maybe. I am struggling with some of the things that you have had the power to do that haven't been done, but I do understand that this is bigger than any one person or any one person actions. And so that's something that I need to work within myself to move around. And so I will attempt to do that. But just based on timeline, it's just really good, I think, to understand. And if you all waited until your second meeting in until your meeting in December, then it would come before us, our final meeting, the second meeting in December. So that's just the groups that are going to be getting together to work on the next steps, just to give you a timeline. It's not a lot of time left.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. We'll do our best.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Have a good evening and meeting adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.